Well, guys, thank you so much for joining me for the Creative Strings podcast. And the first question I want to start out with was, given that, I know that you guys are both really high-level performers and musicians, what is it about teaching that, because I think both of you sort of identify yourselves as being primarily teachers, and correct me if I'm wrong. And part of what I'm looking forward to is I know I'm going to get different perspectives from both of you. Even though you're husband and wife, you're obviously very different people. So I don't know if you could just share with me why you consider yourselves primarily teaching and why you do.
Sure. You want to take this one, or should I jump in?
You can jump in
Sure.
if you like.
The short answer is that it's what we really, really like to do. Both of us have backgrounds from college studying some music ed. That was like my related field, which is practically a minor. I think you were the same thing, right?
Yeah, I was just shy of getting a minor in music ed.
Right.
Or I guess a double degree, really, is what it was going to be.
And all through that process, both of us really loved private teaching. We loved gigging. We loved playing anywhere we could. But working at a studio and teaching was always a huge passion. And it just so happens that that's our main gig now. That's most of what we do, and we love it. So the short answer, that's what we love to do. So we do it.
Yeah.
It's awesome. Do you both consider yourselves primarily like coming from a Suzuki reference? Or how would you describe your reference point? Because obviously you didn't necessarily study Suzuki Pedagogy in college, but as far as I understand, you're both Suzuki registered or Suzuki certified.
Yeah. So I was a Suzuki kid. I got a late start. So I think maybe my experience is a little bit atypical to, I don't know, is there a normal Suzuki kid? I don't know, but like I didn't start when I was in diapers. Hopefully I wasn't in diapers when I was 12. But yeah, so I got a late start, and my mom and I worked our tails off with Ginny, and soon after I discovered viola, which is actually sort of, I feel, my first love, like on a soul level. So that instrument switch happened. But after that, my track it didn't stay on Suzuki for very long. But when I got into college, there is actually a Suzuki school at the Cleveland Institute of Music, the Sato Suzuki School. And it's run right now by Kimberly Meyer-Sims, and she's a teacher trainer. So I actually did 2 years of long-term training where I got all of my registered books from Pre-Twinkle all the way through Book 10 and Practicum. And that was a really intense experience. And there are a lot of different ways to get Suzuki training. That's just one way. Now that I am, a professional and working full-time, it's important to always continue learning and to refresh, your education. So I've been doing short-term classes in the last couple years, or courses, I should say. And that's a totally different type of learning for Suzuki book training. And I think, Neil, that's what you're a little more familiar with, right?
Right. And I mean, my story getting there was a little bit different. I started out pretty skeptical about a lot of stuff in Suzuki method. And basically, I just happened at one time to meet some fantastic teachers who happened to be Suzuki teachers. That's what they did, and it really, really got me interested in it. But yeah, what we do here at our studio, that's pretty much, it starts with that, with the training that we've had from studying there.
From studying Suzuki, you mean?
Yes, yeah, that's pretty, it's pretty safe to say that's the foundation of what we do here at our studio.
Got it. But when you took pedagogy classes in college, Neil, did you have a Suzuki foundation for that, or was it a more standard music education curriculum?
Standard music education curriculum, yeah. Yeah, I wasn't introduced to that until after college.
And so those things dovetail, or do they conflict at all?
I don't see any conflicts. I did notice stuff that was just interestingly different. For example, I noticed that those Suzuki teachers that I talked to were very, very interested in tone, very hugely interested in listening. And the background that I was taught was a little bit more based around starting pizzicato, what fingers you're using on the tapes, and then later one day you graduate with the bow. And I think that's one thing that really caught my attention, just that everything being centered around listening and figuring out that sound you're making. That was a huge appeal.
Is it safe to say that, and I'm just getting an education here, but I mean, is it safe to say that the pedagogy tracks in a typical music education bachelor's degree program is more geared towards teaching in the public schools as opposed to private lessons?
From my experience, that's what it was in my situation and what I was doing. Yes. How about you? Same thing?
I would agree with that. I would agree with that statement. I don't see necessarily that they're mutually exclusive, though. There's a lot of stuff in there, especially like with music learning theory. I think there's a lot of good stuff in there that can be applied to private lessons.
Got it. Yeah. But these are sort of two different communities, though, in a way, right? I mean, a community of public school teachers or school orchestra teachers versus a community of private studio teachers, such as Chili Dog Strings, which is your private studio near Dallas in Frisco, Texas. And I guess the other sort of almost separate community that I wanted to bring into the conversation is the community of people that are interested in music outside of the classical string playing tradition. And I know that Neil has been, sort of venturing into this for a few years. And I mean, Neil's, as far as I'm concerned, Neil, you've got a lot of great things going on as an arranger, as a composer, as an improviser, with all of your production knowledge. And also Rachel is, has been getting into it as well in the last couple of years. But you guys, I guess it's safe to say, have different takes on it. How do you see that, coming into play in either of those other two realms we mentioned, whether it's public school classroom and or the private studios? I mean, why or how are you trying to bring that into the private studio? What kind of things are you seeing? What kind of interest are you seeing from students or parents? What kind of pushback are you seeing from other colleagues at your generation, of other generations? I'm just curious.
I think that it's safe to say that every student that I've seen work with Neil, because he does a lot more of that integration than I do currently, but every student that I've seen that works with Neil absolutely loves it. And of course they adore him and his awesome personality and his energy in the lesson, la la la, all these great things. But a lot of it, I think, has to do with the relevance of what he's teaching. So if we're talking about music, learning music like a language, I think what we need to acknowledge is that there are many different languages within music, right? So I think...
Yeah, I think a lot of people are on the same page. Like, not every student who takes lessons and not every student who does school orchestra is going to go on and be a professional musician or like a concert on stage player. That's just a fact. But being able to cross over and do things makes the music a lot more accessible. Makes it something they can really relate to and really feel when they're exploring the instrument.
And I also think that there's a lot of job opportunity outside of what we classically acknowledge, right? So, I don't know, you get all these kids in music schools that are all clambering to get those spots in those orchestras that really just, I think they think more exist than are actually out there. And then, so if they can't get that, okay, then I'll be an educator and I'll go do a public school teaching gig, or I will go for my third degree and try and do some higher education, right? Like that's what I saw that runs rampant in music schools. So realizing that there's actually, from what I can tell, from what I was exposed to at the Creative Strings workshop this summer, there is a lot of opportunity out there that exists outside the classical realm, that exists outside of, classic academia for music. And so I think that it's actually really responsible to teach your students how to speak some of these different languages, have access to them early on.
And the response from parents is pretty solid too. Yeah. They love seeing what their kids can do when they're playing creatively and doing different things. We haven't seen any kind of pushback at all. It's been very supported.
That's great. Well, yeah, just to sort of give an example of what Rachel mentioned, I mean, my friend Stephen Vance in Pittsburgh, he sends out, I think, up to 4 or 5 or even 6 solo string players on weekends to do weddings and corporate events where their main MO is to take tracks and to play along with pop tracks, like current pop tracks. So you basically take like a karaoke track from iTunes, or like minus the vocals, and which you can get on iTunes for 99 cents. You put it in your phone, you plug it into a speaker, and you blast that music minus 1 track. And then if you're a solo cellist or you're a solo violinist, as long as you're plugged in, it could be electric violin, electric cello, or you could have a pickup. And then you play those current hits. You can just play the melodies. You can even buy the lead sheets. Or I'm sorry, you can buy the actual scores to these, with the melodies written out to a lot of these tunes. Or you can learn it by ear because they're not that hard. And the money that people will pay for this is tremendous. And I know that, and that's for a soloist to go out with tracks. And I know that a lot of string quartets and string trios and sort of, your ceremony string trio are now going to this as well. It's more commonly requested, like the Dallas String Quartet near you guys. They do a lot of gigs where they're playing more popular music. So that speaks to the language of music. And actually, I want to play a track that you did on YouTube, or a few of them actually, Neil. I want to make sure everybody checks out the Chili Dog Strings. That's Chili Dog Strings. And that's your dog, Chili. And it's a CHILI. Well, we're gonna play some of the tracks from YouTube during this podcast. One of my favorites is "Drop It Like Gavotte," which is based on Lully Gavotte. Dum 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 da da dum dum da 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 da. And Neil, you put sort of a funky beat behind it, or whatever you want to call it. Some kind of hip hop beat behind it, and it's awesome. It's one of my favorites. And my son Dalton, who was just starting book 3, he loves it. And Cammie, my oldest child, who went through Suzuki as well, Cammie loves it too. We were all singing along and improvising on it and beatboxing to it. So I mean, this speaks to what Rachel said about teaching kids other languages of music, where you take a Suzuki tune but you put it to a beat, right? And that, but it's more than just language, right? Because, I mean, we really want to get kids improvising, composing, and arranging. I mean, these are processes. These are processes of musicianship that have been typically skipped over in Suzuki and in other classical music education. So I'm curious, are you doing anything to encourage the students in your studio to be arranging or composing or improvising, or are you thinking about ways to do that?
Yes, we do a couple of things. We have workshops regularly where that's all we focus on top of our group classes that are almost every week. About every month or so, we have workshops where they do get to work on improvising and all those things. And it's a ton of fun. They love it. And when we notice, especially if we notice in a kid that they have that inclination to compose and to write, we'll do everything we can to keep that going and nurture it. And it's interesting when you really take the time to see what a student's interests are and see those kind of things they're interested like that, when they're really passionate about it and it makes them want to practice and it makes them want to learn their instrument better. That's a great way to get parents on board too, because then they see how important that is to their kid.
How do you divide up your teaching time or practice time for kids when it comes to this, because I know a lot of teachers think of it as sort of supplemental. The way I do it with both my kids, or did do it with both my kids, is to say, like, okay, you've got to practice all of your Suzuki to-dos, your practice spots, listen 5 times, go through your review material, sort of standard Suzuki things. But then we're going to do our makeup time. And then that's when we do sort of these fun things. There's a risk of treating it like it's just fun or it's just supplemental and feeling like you're diminishing it. But at the same time, well, it is fun. I mean, making music up is fun. How do you do that? Do you do it in a similar way, or are there some kids that's all they want to focus on?
In my part of the studio, I think definitely there's more of a focus on that in a social context, whether it's in the workshops or in the group classes. This is something I am very new to. It's something I just started getting into, so quite honestly for me, I have had limited experience implementing it. But it's something I would like to do. So I don't know. I'd like to hear what Neil has to say about that.
And I mean, and that's fine. You caught up fast. You didn't grow up playing in bands and stuff, but you learned how to do it. For my students, it really ends up being, it's not really like a cookie cutter thing. It really depends on the student. I haven't had any student who I had to fight them to not go all in on that creative type of playing. Our students have been, they pretty much get it that it's a good thing to have a solid classical base to open up more opportunities, and in a lot of cases help them in orchestra too and all that stuff. So for most of our students, who, especially the ones playing in orchestra, they still want to do good in orchestra. So it hasn't really taken away from their classical chops at all. And then there are some students, it kind of depends on how we're helping them practice and what that looks like. But there are some students who it really does help to have, 30 minutes where they'll work on their classical stuff and orchestra stuff, and then maybe an extra 10 or 15 where they get to work on those other places. Some do need it timed out and scheduled a little bit. So it really just depends on the student.
That's cool. I like that. Well, and I guess one thing that comes to my mind is, I suppose, Rachel, if you had a student that really was showing an interest in improvisation or arranging or contemporary styles, you could say, okay, well, we're going to shift you over to Neil's studio, right?
Oh, believe me, I've been tempted.
Yeah. But that's the interesting thing, is we get to work together on it. There are times when I'll jump in and I'll help Rachel's kids with that stuff, or even last week, I needed help with a really young cello student. Rachel came in and helped and did her focus exercises and all this stuff, and it was great. Mm-hmm. So that's part of what we do. Work together.
Well, yeah, I like the fact that you have different skill sets and different perspectives. And I think, as I understand it, Rachel is registered with all of the Suzuki books, and maybe Neil, you've been registered with a couple or something like that, right?
Yeah, through 3 different ones.
So I'm guessing that Rachel has a lot of other tools in her bag to bring out in certain areas that you don't necessarily have, and you
Absolutely.
can go to her for those things. And part of why I'm interested in this conversation is because of the difference in perspective. I mean, in a sense, Neil, you're kind of like all in. Since I've known you for the last couple of years, you've always been sort of all in about, like, I want to do beatboxing and cello, and I want to write songs and improvise, and this is what I want to teach, and how can I do it? And and in a way, I felt like you kind of didn't almost recognize how advanced of a creative cello player and musician you are, because it's not the world that you live in most of the time. You're usually teaching in your studio, and I kind of had to say to you a lot of times, like, Neil, you're one of the most creative cello players I know out there, and you're like, well, that's fine, but I really just want to teach, and which is great, and you're sharing a lot of that with your creative videos, and which is awesome, passing it on for other teachers. And I can't tell people enough who are listening, you've got to go to Chili Dog Strings on YouTube and check out Neil's videos. But I might have lost my train of thought there. I apologize. But yeah, so Neil's really all in. Rachel has been curious and or sometimes skeptical, I feel like, and that's why that's what I like about this conversation with you two is seeing this, these difference in perspectives. So Rachel, talk about your skepticism. I don't want you to feel like we're ganging up on you and you have to you have to like comply and be with us. I mean, we really want to have a positive dialogue because we really want to know, like, how can we bring, unify our community is really what we're talking about.
Bring it on.
I feel like, I mean, Chris, I've known you since I started with Ginny. And so, like, you've always sort of been around in my life. And I noticed probably when I was in early undergrad that you were putting together those creative strings workshops. And I think I had inquired, like, quite a few years ago, hey, I want to come check it out. And, being someone who didn't understand how to not be flaky yet, I guess I just wasn't there yet. So I sort of let that thread go unexplored. It's something that's always grabbed my attention. I think the way it was presented to me in my personal music education was kind of that idea of like, oh, it's on the side. Oh, it's for fun. Oh, it's supplemental. And, and additionally, I thought, oh, it's this big scary thing called improv and you have to make it up and it is kind of inaccessible. And I don't know, I thought it was terrifying. So it's something that's always intrigued me, but I feel like I haven't always had good access to it. So this summer when we came to the Creative Strings workshop, that was like me going way out of my comfort zone.
Now, hang on a second. Are you saying that improvising is like more nerve-wracking than doing like playing a concerto with an orchestra?
I think she is. I mean,
honestly. I think one situation is much more preferable than the other. So that has been really interesting. And, in the lessons I took with you before, those 6 lessons that we had, you kept telling me, like, you've got this, this stuff, like, you can do it. You've got everything you need to make it happen. And I don't know what it is. Maybe it's just like going back to square one and having 0 skills, even though I had some skills even when I went back to square one, right? Because I have some of this knowledge from before that I retained. But I don't know. It's not even skepticism. It's like there's some block there for me. There's a barrier. And I'm sure it's me getting in the way of myself. So that's something that I think it takes a lot of honesty and it takes a lot of examination. But what I do know from going to the workshop this summer, especially, but even before that, but the way that some of these, I think especially young people, the way they can just gather around and take a moment in time, just like they can just grab something out of the air and make a conversation with music that no one planned it, they just got together and all of a sudden there's this wicked jam going on. I think of that jam. Are you thinking of the one in the courtyard with Rose Cammie? And Georgia and Cammie and Carl and I think maybe Sarah was out there too. And I hope I'm not forgetting anyone, but it was so cool. The way that they can, that full listening loop where they can listen, process, produce, and then come back around, and that whole time they're all working together to make something totally incredible that's never existed before and will never exist the same way again. That's so powerful.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. So it sounds like it almost kind of took being there live, experiencing it live, which is something as Suzuki teachers or as classical teachers we always stress to our kids too, right? Recitals live and not just listen to the tape. But it sounds like that was almost maybe a aha moment for you, because you'd obviously been feeling resistant about it, as you said, for maybe a couple of years, and seeing Neil get excited about it and working with me on it, but then still not being sure. But then when you were in that space with people doing it, it sounds like that really you kind of got it. Is that true? Or
I think so. I think it made it more tangible in a way, even though the experience I was having was totally not tangible. But it
right.
made it real for me. Yeah.
That's cool. That's cool. And for anybody that doesn't know, the Creative Strings Workshop is the annual gathering of creative string players in Columbus, Ohio. You can learn about it on my website, christianhouse.com. Just click on education. And we just had our 15th summer. Definitely make sure to check that out. But going back to what we were talking about, Rachel, why I think it's so valuable, and I so appreciate you talking honestly about your, if we're not going to use the word skepticism, maybe we could use the word resistance. I'm not sure. Because I guess I would ask you to confirm or deny this. Do you see that a lot of other classical teachers or Suzuki teachers out there might experience the same feeling that you do about this?
Oh, I'm sure. Because, like as much as we get training through different methodologies, I think that almost all of us draw somewhat on our experience with performing, right? Like that's a really important part of it. And that ability to perform requires a certain amount of ownership, over the skills that you're trying to teach someone else. So I think there's resistance when you don't have confident ownership over maybe this different way of playing. And then you're trying to deliver that information to students. The other thing is I have not really seen any educators who are resistant to having kids exposed or even learning about all these different types of ways of playing. I think the hardest thing, resistance-wise, is finding people who know how to teach it well, who can teach it to the standards of teaching as we know it, right? In this other way of teaching. And that's been my biggest struggle with it is, I'm always bugging you like, so what's the curriculum? How do I start? Like, what are the first things? And then where does it go from here, right? And I think that a lot of that is because, there's all this freedom and everything. And the magic of a lot of what I saw this summer is it seems like it's very structured, but it's also incredibly not structured. And I don't know, that's really scary. Mm-hmm. And I think maybe just through my experiences as an educator, freedom comes through structure. So I'm trying to figure out, like, what are the best ways that I can present this information in a way that they can grab onto and, build their foundation really solidly. I don't want to give them any holes. And I don't know. So that's something I'm trying to figure out. And I think that's one of the biggest things I've seen, and I know Neil has seen, and we just talked to another colleague like last week who said they've seen a lot of hacks try and teach this kind of stuff where it's just, it's not presented well. And because it's so new to the students, I think a lot of people end up walking away feeling like it was an unsuccessful experience. And that is an education failure when that happens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And to that, I would say, first of all, I've been spending 20 years trying to put structure or curriculum or sequence to, a lot of these concepts and skills. How can we teach classically trained players to deal with internalizing harmony, internalizing rhythm, improvising, learning different styles of music, learning to arrange, learning to function in the bass role, the inner voice role, the melodic role, all these things, and trying to segment it. And I think for anybody to take it on at first, it's overwhelming. And even if you say to someone 5, 10, 20 times, here's the structure, here's the curriculum, they're still going to walk away from that like, I don't get it. It's all, it's like, well, right. Because it's just a lot of new information, right? Sure. And even in the 6 lessons that each of you did with me separately, it was, in theory, it was broken down into these different components, talking about voice leading, talking about free improvisation. In addition, though, to that, I think that we have to, and this is an area where I don't consider myself as strong, but I think that when we're talking about early childhood pedagogy versus teenagers, there's different types of things that kids at different ages are going to be receptive to, especially intuitive versus analytical, and when do you start offering theory, or just like when do you start offering reading versus and that's why for me, if it's age 3 to 8, I'm usually dealing in the realm of more intuitive. Hey, let's just have fun. Let's just make stuff up. Let's create some. I heard about something recently I heard that, and I'm sorry that I don't know who it was, but I think it's a clinician in New York who was really influencing a lot of Suzuki teachers about this thing that we talked about earlier, which is just to let kids have time to play whatever they want, which to us sounds mind-blowing, like you said, like there's not enough structure. But I have literally seen that for age 3 to 7, including my son, that it really can be the best thing for a kid at that age who is still somewhat a blank slate, and to just say, okay, just make any sound you want, and to be able to sort of be there, be mindful, and to be able to facilitate that and just support it. I feel like part of that is really actually getting out of the way and not necessarily giving structure. It's like letting them, just create it. But I might be talking too much.
No, I love that. I think that's so cool. Yeah, that's great.
But at the age of 8, at the age of 12, there might be transitions that we need to make where we introduce new concepts. And with me not being an expert in early childhood pedagogy, despite the fact that I've had 2 kids, I'm cautious about, being dogmatic with those prescriptions. But I do want to ask you about, first of all, I want to say, Rachel, that I appreciate your honesty and transparency in this process, because I think it's so valuable. And there are so many teachers out there that I run into who I feel like are stopped by sort of being afraid of, the newness, or what they don't know, and that they're not necessarily willing to say that, and I feel like maybe it holds them back, maybe it holds their students back. And so
Sure.
I think you're a great example in the sense that you're just like willing to continue pushing and pursuing this and seeing where it can go. Mm-hmm. But I wanted to ask about, since you guys are kind of on the cusp of a new generation, of teachers, and in your young 30s, if I understand correctly, and are you around 30, something like this?
Yeah, right? I'm a little older. She's a little younger.
All right, but you're
right. You're right.
Yeah, but you're not only are you like young teachers, but you're young and established teachers. Like you have a lot of history. Actually, you've been working for several years with studios, different places. You're creating content. You're doing workshops. You're really engaged. You're really serious teachers. But you're very young, and so I'm curious if you notice like a difference between older generations of teachers in terms of how they take to these ideas, and or to your own peer group, people your own age. I don't imagine that many people who are as young as you and are as established as teachers, but I'm just curious.
That's a very interesting question, because I can tell you, I don't know what everybody out there is thinking, but I can tell you what we've seen. We've had a lot of positive support from some older Suzuki teachers, especially on Facebook. We don't have a whole lot of older Suzuki teachers following us on Instagram, but on Facebook, there are some that we keep up with, and we get a really good response from those. What do you think? What do you think about the generational difference? Because there's always been, I know I don't want to throw all this kind of playing under a label, but when it comes to supplemental music in the Suzuki world, there have been several works outside of those main Suzuki books that have been embraced with open arms. So surprisingly, the response has been pretty good, even across generations. What do you think, though?
Yeah, I think Suzuki world is kind of a funny thing. And I think that just to be aware of not being ageist, I really think it has there are people, in older generations who are stuck in their mindset. But I've met some super old 26-year-olds too. You know what I mean? So I think it's just a mindset thing. There are things that I can probably be old and cranky about if we sit and think about it really hard.
No.
So,
No.
But, so I think it's more of a mindset issue than it is a generational thing. Yeah, I don't know, because some of the best support we've gotten is from people in those older generations. We have a lot of people, our peers, who I think are very supportive, are very curious, definitely enthusiastic. There are definitely more of us, I think, in our age group than in the older generations. But I really have run into very few people who have been actually resistant to the idea. I honestly, like I said before, I think the biggest thing is that a lot of people, they just want to see it taught well. If you're going to do it, they want to see it really come to fruition in a way that their kids can actually use it, take it with them for their lifetime, not just have one little workshop and then,
that's it.
It's kind of a blip. So, I don't know if that really answers your question or if it makes for a juicy conversation.
Yeah, it may depend on the person more than the generational gap.
So, it's that Suzuki idea of Suzuki imparted all of this wisdom on us, and then when we take that method and that philosophy, it then becomes that individual plus what Suzuki taught. So everyone is different. Every individual teaches their own style a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a good point.
Suzuki Gilfillan.
Right.
Suzuki Samson.
Right.
Kind of thing.
Because that's what it's all about.
Yeah.
Your own method under it.
And that brings me back. So it sounds like you're saying, people of any generation could be for or against being more creative in how you apply the Suzuki method to teaching young musicians, and whether or not you're going outside of the books, whether or not you're introducing new concepts. And that, I guess, gets me back to, why do you teach, right? Because you're saying, the people, they just care about good teaching. So what is good teaching? And why do you teach?
Well, I teach for people. That's my biggest thing. It's really about the personal connection. There is nothing like working with a 4-year-old for an entire year and teaching them how to problem solve and showing them all the possibilities that are available to them. And I think that sort of facilitating a way for parents and children to create a stronger bond through a specific activity, like learning how to play the violin, is really magical. That's something in my relationship with my mom that no one can take away, that's a very special bond that I have with her. And there were a lot of ups and downs, but it was all very meaningful and really important to the way that my life has gone and what I see as important, And
this you're kind of referencing the triangle, right? The famous Suzuki triangle, parent, teacher, student. I've heard people say, and disclaimer, I'm a Suzuki kid and a Suzuki dad twice over. I'm not registered as a Suzuki teacher. So, but obviously I have an opinion. But I've heard people say that, they thought this was a horrible idea, having the parents sit in on the lessons. What do you say to that?
I say Suzuki lessons are not for everybody. That's what I say. They're not for everybody. Nice. Not everyone has to consume the Suzuki lesson, But there are a lot of people where it works beautifully for them.
And it depends. I have some older students who their parents don't sit in on their lessons. But for little kids, the idea is that the parents are helping them practice throughout the week, and we don't want to leave them in the dark. We want parents to know what's expected and what they should be practicing. So, especially for the tiny kids, it helps a ton.
Yeah. Well, I know my experience, having seen, having had that, my mom being involved as the teaching parent, I guess. I know what you're saying, Rachel. Like, I experienced that, and also, both of my kids, their moms, I witnessed that relationship, and I know personally as a dad that my relationship with my kids, there's so much foundation there from the time that we spent playing music together. So I can testify to that.
That's beautiful. I didn't have that as a kid. I was just practicing in my room by myself, trying to see how fast I could play can-can. Like, I didn't grow up with this stuff. This is beautiful.
So Neil, why do you teach?
It's my favorite gig. That's the real honest answer. It's my favorite gig. I love helping kids figure out how to overcome obstacles that they have on their instrument, how to figure themselves out a little bit. Not like I have all the answers or anything, but I love seeing students, everything from being able to take ownership of what they're doing, to be able to express themselves, or to take pride in something that they worked on or wrote, and be able to feel really good about working hard on that. I like it because playing music is something where even at a young age, kids can figure that out and see that their hard work paid off on it.
Those are great answers. Thank you, guys. So, what makes a good teacher? What makes teaching good?
I think a lot of it is empathy, understanding where a student is at any age,
meeting them where they're at.
And just trying to figure out what's going on. If things aren't going as planned, why isn't it going as planned? It might not always be that the kid just simply doesn't get it, or it might not even be. It's important to consider how ready a kid is to learn, like their mindset. Because the same formulas might not work for every kid, So I think just trying to meet them where they're at and work with what you've got.
What does that mean, meet them where they're at? Can you give me an example? Because I've heard that before.
Sure. For example, I think about this right now. I have a student who, it would be, let's see. And everybody will be able to relate to this. I have a student who doesn't practice enough. Like that's the general phrase. He could probably practice more. I'm sure of this. But what I'm working on now, talking to him and talking to his mom, is figuring out what's going on, because it seems that when he does practice for a 30 or 45 minutes solid, it seems that he does get really distracted. It seems that he does have issues focusing. And I think what helps make a good teacher, or help meet them where they're at, is trying to figure out with the kid why they're getting off track, why they're getting distracted. If sitting down and practicing for 45 minutes isn't working right now, you can crack the whip, or get mad at them in the lesson for that and try to guilt them into practicing more. But I think it's better when you can instead try to set attainable goals for them. Try to see what is going to set up a strong foundation so that they can start doing better.
Yeah, I think a good teacher is someone who helps their students remove barriers. Because that's what, at the very beginning, you have like the most fundamental barrier, which is, I don't know how to play my instrument and I know nothing about music. And then slowly you sort of chip away at that until you discover this beautiful musician underneath. I think the other thing that makes a teacher great is becoming obsolete eventually, right? So the whole give a man a fish, teach a man to fish saying, I think, applies here.
So you're teaching someone to to come up with their own solutions so that they can be their own teacher later. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, giving them tools so that they can guide themselves. I mean, that's what we want. We want them to know how to practice. They want them to know how to analyze what's going on with their intonation or with their bow strokes or with their phrasing, or why is it that my practicing isn't that productive right now? Just like getting to the root of all of this stuff. And, first we help facilitate the removal of barriers, and then eventually we teach them how to do it themselves. And that's what I think is so cool is really he teaches cello, I teach viola and violin, but really it has nothing to do with that. It has to do with learning how to live your life, right? That's the magic of Suzuki method, because I think he really expressed that so beautifully when he talks about creating noble human beings and creating children with beautiful hearts. Like it's people who really seek to give purpose to their lives. They're always looking forward. How can we do better? So I don't know.
I'm curious if you could say more about that, because I've heard that expressed eloquently before. You say that you're not teaching, I've heard it said many times, Suzuki said, we're not teaching children to be virtuosos, we're teaching them to be noble human beings or better human beings. How do you apply that in a practical scenario? How does that come across in a lesson? I mean, you said you're helping them to strive to be better, I guess is how you've summed it up, but is there more that you would say about that? Or
oh my goodness.
My thoughts on that were that idea first caught my attention when I read Nurtured by Love for the first time, Suzuki's book. I read that, I think I was like 29 when I read it. And it's awesome. And, people can interpret some of these things different ways when you talk about things in teaching, like character building. But the base, one thing that you can get all Suzuki teachers to agree on is that it's all about listening. It's all about creating more sensitive musicians who aren't just blasting what they're doing and not thinking about it. And I think that those qualities of being able to listen to others and being able to be sensitive with what you have that you can work with, those are qualities of good character.
Absolutely.
So there's a lot of examples of that when you're teaching a musician to play music more sensitively, or play music better, or more in tune, more supportively, more together, all these kinds of things. But you're saying that for every one of those, it's a parallel in our character and how we can live our lives and be better human beings. Is that a fair synopsis?
That's the goal.
Sure, I think that's fair.
Yeah. And I guess that is different from what I hear from a lot of more, I don't know if you want to say old school classical teaching. I mean, what's the difference? Is the difference in sort of old school classical teacher, they're all trying to get them in fifth position, right away with a big vibrato, playing really fast? How is that, what's the risk of that kind of old school approach, or what's the difference between that and the Suzuki approach?
I think there's a lot of awareness in the Suzuki approach of the idea of success, right? And setting kids up so that their ability always begets more ability, right? Mm-hmm. So when you have a situation where you set a kid up for something that they've never had any experience with before, and you give them very limited tools as to how to successfully accomplish it, I think it starts to introduce this idea of failure, fear of failure sometimes. At the very least, that's, in my opinion, that's not the best way to teach. And that is for sure an opinion, because I know other people would say otherwise, and that's fine. But I think there are ways where you can just show them this is everything that you're going to need to do a great job, And why I struggle with why you would want to teach any other way, right? Like, why wouldn't you give your children all the tools that they need to, like, just do it well?
And it's interesting that you say that, because off the top of my head, I'm thinking of many times where I've talked to colleagues who will talk about their teachers and how mean they were, or like how things operated with shame. And when I think about the teachers that I trained with doing my Suzuki training, Tanya Carey, Andrea Yoon, they use so much positivity in their teaching. They didn't have to get negative and shame kids and do all this stuff that by the time those kids are like 30 have weird like blocks and issues going on from a mean teacher, you know?
I see. So I'm hearing that there's a focus on virtuosity in some other methods, which may resort to this kind of using the stick or whatever, and you're saying that's not a healthy thing, and so you want to try to use positivity and not focus so much on this like moving fast to this path to virtuosity.
I just think it's a very limited approach. You know, if the idea really is to teach students ways to approach life, like if their life is always closed in on them and they're just constantly going to be worried about, there's this stuff out there that I don't know how to do, I have an obstacle and I may or may not make it, the world is a dangerous place, I might fail. You know, that's a very limited way to exist in life. And I think instead, if you say, well, here are the things that I know that I can do, let's see what I can make of this, that's an extremely empowering way to approach your life, you know? And so, I don't know, that's the difference that I see. I don't want to judge anyone and say, like, oh, this is unhealthy, even though I might argue that. But, you know, essentially, it's about, you know, like what's empowering our students and what's limiting them, because we're trying to remove those limits.
And I think, you know, it also, I guess in the end, it sort of goes teacher by teacher, because, like, I brought up the thing about the thing about mean teachers just popped in my mind, because like when I think about great Suzuki teachers I know, they operated with positivity, so that just came to mind. But I know some Suzuki teachers who are like super what
Nothing.
who are like super virtuosic with what they did. Like they'll have tiny kids playing crazy stuff. And on the flip side, I know some teachers who aren't Suzuki teachers who, you know, with young kids, their stuff will be really in order too. So I guess in the end, you know, that stuff depends on the teacher, but that attitude of operating with love and respecting a child where they are, that's something that's definitely a Suzuki concept.
Cool. So, well, you know, a lot of this conversation has been, and maybe I've pushed it that way, to sort of, you know, learn more about, you know, Suzuki teachers and why you feel the way you do. And, you know, I'll be honest, part of my motivation is because I think, you know, sometimes there are unfair criticisms of Suzuki. What are some of the criticisms that you guys hear about the Suzuki method, and maybe some that you think are unfair, and maybe some that you think might be fair, or how would you address those? And I appreciate what you already said earlier, which was, you know, it might not be for everybody. That's fine. You know, like we're not going to try to force anybody to to do this if they don't want to.
Yeah, that's all based on choice, right? So,
right.
I think hands down, the one that, I don't know if people say this, but the experience that I have as someone who offers Suzuki lessons and gets consumers who are skeptical about what I have to offer, I think it's the idea that I think Christine Goodner, who's a colleague of ours, we do a lot online with her if you want to check her out. She's on Facebook, Suzuki Triangle Community. There's a lot of good stuff there. But the idea that Suzuki is kind of a countercultural thing these days. It doesn't necessarily fit well within the modern structure of the family, at least here in America. You know, I think the way it was designed when Suzuki was alive was sort of a very traditional setup where, even in his books, he will specify the mother will attend the lesson with the child, right? And we know now, at least around here, like any possible way you can imagine a family being, that's how families are. So, there's all sorts of structures. And I think the biggest difference is, I think there are a lot more families where both parents are working. And so it's a lot more difficult to commit the kind of time and resources necessary to really successfully achieve a Suzuki experience. And that's the number one reason why I say it's not a good fit for everybody. First of all, I can't teach everybody. And secondly, it's just not a good fit for everyone, whether it's, the lessons aren't costing what you wish they would cost, or you don't want to put in the time, or you don't want to drive this many times a week to get to the studio. There's all sorts of stuff like that.
If you want to drop off your 4-year-old so you can go grocery shopping, Suzuki method might not be the best use of your money. It just might. It's a very expensive babysitter at that point. It's not worth your time.
It's not what we're about, So that's something that I think is very common, but it's not necessarily verbally articulated to me. But I just wanted to bring that to you.
I'll say my number one thing. Actually, I'm very excited to say this because I don't think I've ever said this on record or anything. But I was very skeptical at first. I got into Suzuki teaching because it lined up with a gig that I knew to teach at a school, and I had to get Suzuki training. And like I was there. I was I don't know, maybe I was like 28 or something like that. I'm 33 now. And I just remember just when I went to get that training, at this point, I knew some good Suzuki teachers, so I was on board. But for years before that, my biggest thing I heard was Suzuki students don't read music. And that's all I had to hear for me to go, well, that's no good. Like, sight reading is important. I didn't even look into the other side, But even now, it's like we'll be communicating with people who are interested in lessons or whatever, and sometimes that's the first thing we'll hear, like, oh, but we want our kids to learn how to read music. And it's like, I've heard that there are some old school teachers out there who maybe at the start didn't do as much note reading, but now like note reading classes for kids are the norm, assuming that they're old enough to read.
Right.
And it's pretty standard stuff.
Yeah. I started playing when I was 5, and probably didn't start reading until I was 7 or 8, but my reading is very strong. And I've seen that my kids started earlier. I think Dalton started reading when he was even 4, maybe. So I guess they're or maybe 5, I can't remember. But how do you have an age where you start kids reading generally, or does it fluctuate?
Well,
just curious.
My philosophy on it is around the time that they can somewhat master the reading of their first language.
Got it.
That's when it's appropriate to really go into that full on. That being said, there are a lot of activities that we do with music theory, sort of like pre-music theory activities that we do in group class, where they're getting a lot of that information and they just don't know what it is yet. And that is what I think is most appropriate for them at that stage of development, And the cool thing is when you don't put pressure on it, be like, you have to learn how to read this music, you must understand this theory. They do great, So when you take that out of the picture, so.
And one more criticism that I've heard that I think it's worth considering is I've heard some people criticize that it takes I don't know how long it takes, but there's a lot of music, especially in the beginning, that's based on very similar kinds of scales, a lot of Mozart, a lot of Bach, then you move to Beethoven. And so that's that criticism, that kids aren't exposed to a lot of different sounds and from different places or whatever. However, I have noticed that a lot of teachers do end up bringing in other things, kind of like we're trying to do. And even on our YouTube channel, in our playlists, we have some stuff that's organized by book for what the kids are playing, but we also put our jams and encourage kids to listen to different stuff with their instruments, what people are doing now with their players. I know a ton of my students have seen your video of you playing some Gnarls Barkley on violin and getting blown away by that, So,
well, and that's a really good point too. I think about the difference between a method and a collection of repertoire, and obviously Suzuki starts with Twinkle, and I've both of my kids spent about a year on Twinkle, and I think it was appropriate. I was there, I witnessed the whole thing. I think it was appropriate for various reasons. But I agree with what you said. Like a lot of Suzuki teachers, they take it on themselves to bring in additional repertoire that's age appropriate or level appropriate, and I think that's important too. But I think that people need to recognize that Suzuki teachers have that autonomy to use what is in the books, and also to borrow and share from within the community and develop their own approach. So that's great. I appreciate you making those distinctions. Well, and one of the kind of the points that comes up for me out of this is really the difference between arguing about methods and arguing about good versus talking about good teaching. Because, what I appreciate from the conversation with you guys, all the conversations I have with you guys, is how dedicated you are to teaching. And it just seems like such an obvious thing to me that, people who care about teaching tend to be good teachers, and sort of the method almost becomes, or the repertoire or what's covered, in the end can become secondary if you don't have that foundation of the heart behind it. And so I think it's kind of silly that people spend so much time nitpicking or, picking at each other about the difference between this approach to the pinky vibrato or what a bow holds.
Right.
When it's really what's more important is does a teacher care? Is a teacher invested? Is a teacher always investing in training, being open to different ideas, different approaches so that they can help their students and the parents succeed? So I really just, humbly acknowledge you for the work that you do. I think it's so, so important, and I'm in awe of it. I mean, just, the fact that you give so much to your students and to their parents, and for all the teachers out there that do this. It's really, really inspiring to me. It's part of the reason I wanted to bring you guys on. Because for a lot of people who listen to this, some may be teachers, some may be performers, some may do a little of this and a little of that. And most of us as musicians, I think we do a lot of things. We perform, we might compose, we might improvise, we might play different instruments, we might teach, but it becomes kind of a hierarchy or a balance. And I'm just amazed at folks like you who put teaching at the top of that hierarchy for yourselves. There was, I think, one question. One question that I wanted to ask, and then there might be something else. But I asked a guy when I was in Norway last year. I'm going back to Norway here in a couple weeks, and I stayed with a teacher. He was a school teacher. He wasn't a music teacher. But I asked him, I said, what makes a great teacher? And he said, well, there's three things that make a great teacher. He says, you've got to know your stuff. You've got to come to the student from where they're at, which he said. And he said, and you've got to come from a place of love. And he said, if you do those three things, you'll be a good teacher. That's good teaching. Do you agree with that? Or would you say anything in addition to that? Or does that resonate for you?
I love that. That resonates so clearly. So clearly.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's cool. Well, what should we let people know about? Is there anything else that you'd like to talk about, and or what can we let people know about? I already told people about Chili Dog Strings YouTube channel, and I believe also ChiliDogStrings.com, where not only can people find Neil's YouTube videos and maybe some of Rachel's YouTube videos, but also Rachel's blogs, book reviews. You guys recently did a review about a great book about the Suzuki Triangle, and you've got all these great inspirational videos for any parents or kids who are going through Suzuki training and other teachers who might want to share stuff with their parents and their kids or get inspired for different ways that they can teach. I know you guys are in Frisco, Texas, which I believe is a suburb of Dallas. So, of course, anybody in Texas should be connecting with you guys about workshops, but you're also traveling around the country and doing different things. You've got roots in Michigan. Is there any other things that we could send people to learn about more of your content?
Other than that, the other places, well, first, actually, just to point out, one of the big reasons about why we post stuff online anyway, a lot of what we do is through the lens, at least I'm speaking for myself here, a lot of it is through the lens of what would have really motivated me when I was a young kid playing cello. So for that reason, even though we don't get to tour around performing as much as we want, that's why we try to put as much stuff on our YouTube channel, and we love seeing when our students get excited about it and see what they can do with their instruments. Same thing with parents. We try to think about what kind of stuff can we share with our studio and then share with others online to help them out with what they're doing, whether it's practicing or teaching, whatever. So yeah, and a lot of that, the regular stuff on the journey of what we do is on Facebook, on Instagram, especially Facebook, a lot of the stuff we share there. So yeah, anybody listening to this, check out that Facebook page too. And if any of that stuff is helpful for you, whether it's a performance to show students or anything that we do with teaching that we figured out that we like, go for it, use it. We hope it helps.
And that's Chili Dog Strings on Facebook as well as .com. And I know that if they go to chilidogstrings.com, they can get on your mailing list, and you guys send a lot of really great content out there, which is awesome. Anything else you want to share, Rachel, as far as what you want people to be checking out or how they can engage with you? Or?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. It's just if you're listening to this and you jive with what we're saying and you want to connect, we love hearing from you. We love to connect and create a bigger sense of community, sort of something we've been exploring really intently this last year is the idea of collaboration instead of competition. And that's, maybe that's a discussion for another day. But, just finding people who are like-minded and are interested in joining the conversation, because the more work that we're all contributing to each other, it turns out the less work we all have to do. And I just, and everyone is so unique and individual, and it would be so cool to see what other people are doing and to share ideas. So,
yeah. And you guys are interested, you're open to doing more stuff at camps in the summers, as far as I know. Yeah. people are looking for a great violin and cello team that can go in a lot of different directions, age groups, skills and concepts. I think it's a good bet. Anything else that we should touch on?
Well, Chris, I was a little curious, if you don't mind answering. I would love to hear sort of about your journey because you do have that Suzuki experience, that foundation. What was your journey like from Suzuki into jazz and, other realm music? Like I don't know if I really know that story fully, so I'd love to hear about that.
Are we allowed to ask this?
That's great. That's a great question.
I wonder how you made it happen.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's a great question. Well, yeah, I had a Suzuki background from age 5, and all the normal stuff, And then when I was in high school, my sophomore year, some of my friends started playing in like a garage rock band, and I just noticed, just to be 1,000% honest, like I just noticed that all the girls were more interested in my friends that played rock music in high school. Just being completely honest about it. And even though I got some attention for my advanced level as a violinist, obviously, but I was really envious of my friends who were the so-called creative types, because it seemed so mysterious and so personal and original that they were, jamming and coming up with their own songs. And I was just like, well, I don't know how to do that. Plus, I was getting into rock music. So I picked up an electric bass and started figuring out how to play some electric bass and some electric guitar. I took a couple lessons, and then that was sort of the doorway for me, and then just started kind of piecing it together very clumsily, very awkwardly. And I was also playing multiple instruments. I was playing cello in my high school orchestra, and I was, I played a little bit on the piano and started songwriting and stuff. And so I just was kind of piecing the pieces of the puzzle together, at first between very disparate musical experiences. On one hand, the garage rock band, where what was up was now down, and what was down was now up. And I was sort of learning from my friends who were mostly self-taught, but they were sort of telling me that, like, no, you can play a D7. You don't have to play just a D major triad. And there's not a rule that, sort of challenging my idea that, that this was how music was. It sort of showed me that there was a lot more out there. Just kind of piecing it together, and until I went to college and then played in other kinds of like blues bands and funk bands and rock bands. And then I got into a fusion band, and then it kind of goes from there. But it was sort of I was inspired to try to learn from other people and try to piece it together. It was very frustrating at first, and ultimately I was able to piece it together and bring those disparate worlds together, and which is why I feel like I can really relate to folks like you guys who come from a similar background as me and have similar questions and similar struggles when you try to reconcile those interests and those worlds, So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, for sure.
I totally feel that, because I remember being in high school and picking up guitar and playing chords and just thinking, oh man, this is like the most next level thing, learning how to play chords. And then that feeling of being able to bring it later on the cello, when I realized you can play chords on cello, and it's like, wow, cello's even more cool than I thought. And then the same thing, it's like, I remember scratching and mixing on the turntables and thinking, oh my gosh, these rhythmic complexities, this is amazing. And then later, when I realized you can do cool rhythmic stuff on the cello or violin or viola, what? Like, I don't know if you had moments like that where you do something on another instrument, and then when you try it on your own instrument, you just kind of just open new doors.
Well, yeah, it was all about trying to copy the lead guitar solos on Led Zeppelin and Jimi Hendrix records at first for me, and then eventually it was trying to copy Stevie Wonder's voice or or whatever, and eventually trying to check out the left hand of whoever, McCoy Tyner on the piano, and and eventually but I remember, because that was probably like 1986 or something like, or 1988. I remember that Kronos Quartet played on the Tonight Show, and they played Purple Haze. And I remember thinking at that time, well, a mixture of excitement and a mixture of, what's the word? Being disheartened, because I thought that it was my idea.
Oh, no.
I thought, this is my idea. I was going to be the one that unveiled, Jimi Hendrix on violin to the world, and here Kronos Quartet beat me to it on the Tonight Show. But then I remember clearly seeing like, oh, this is going to go somewhere. This has got to go somewhere. Like in the future, string instruments are going to play all this kinds of music, and worlds are going to come together. And so that was, I don't know, 40 years ago or something like that. So I think it's fair to say that it is all coming together, and that if you just look at how it's progressed in the last 40 years, and I think that a lot of us are still in various degrees of resisting that or whatever, but I feel pretty confident that it is growing. And I think it's folks like you that make me feel that confidence, and I love seeing that. I love seeing it come full circle and seeing it come in the Suzuki studio, where people like you guys are just open to everything that you can do to foster and empower young musicians. So thank you guys so very much, and we will send everybody your way.
Oh, thanks
Sounds
so
good.
much for having us, Chris. This was great.
Yeah, we really enjoyed it.